Hi, this is Debony Morgan, and you're listening to The Spirit of Now, a podcast of Zeitgeist, Atlanta's home for the spiritually independent, and now reaching beyond Atlanta with our remote programs. Today on the show, we're going to talk to Carl McColman about his upcoming workshop with us, Contemplation and Practice, Wisdom of the World's Mystical Traditions. Carl is just an amazing teacher. We're very excited. He is a commissioned centering prayer teacher, a life-professed lay associate of the Trappist monks, and the author of books like The Big Book of Christian Mysticism and An Invitation to Celtic Wisdom. While Carl's own practice is steeped in Christian contemplation, he's been active in the interfaith community for many years and has taught world mysticism courses through Emory Continuing Education and the Neshama Interfaith Center. So we're about to turn you over to that interview with Carl. I do want to give us a heads up, though. As mysticism is such a part of transcending everyday life, but also being very intimately involved with everyday life, we had some everyday life interference during the interview, and you may hear some angry neighbor yelling in the background. With our editing, it was a little hard to get that out. So be patient, and it'll keep you listening. So here we are with Carl McColman talking about our upcoming workshop in the fall, Contemplation and Practice, Wisdom of the World's Mystical Traditions. And Carl, we're happy, as always, to have you back teaching and also to have you talking with us today about that. So my first question is, what the heck is mysticism? What are we wading into here? It sounds like something very big and billowy and hard to pin down. Mm-hmm. Tell us, oh wise one.
Okay, grasshopper. It is a word that many people use in different ways. So it is a tricky word to kind of, like you say, pin down, as it were. So I like to go back to kind of its root. It comes out of the Greek language, and it comes from the same root that we get mystery from, but not mystery in a Hardy Boys Nancy Drew sense.
Oh,
More, hey, more mystery in a, you can't put it into words sense. Right. It's not so much a problem to be solved as entering into kind of a dimension of life that grammar, words, syntax, even thought ultimately don't take us all the way there. Where the mind has its limits, the heart can go the distance. So mysticism invites us into the mystery of God, the mystery of spirit, the mystery of the soul, the mystery of life, the mystery of love. And when we talk about a mystical spirituality, we're really just talking about that dimension of spirituality that brings us into that kind of deeply heart-centered space, that space where we can encounter that which cannot be named, that which, some people call God, some people call spirit, some people call the absolute or the ultimate, the really real. All names break down, but it's human nature to try to name the mystery, so we keep doing that. But I think it's helpful to use a word like mysticism or mystery to remember that our language ultimately only takes us so far, because that helps us to avoid traps like dogmatism or fundamentalism or those kinds of things that sometimes tend to separate us rather than really bring us into union.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the first image that comes to my mind for that is not so much on the where it goes place, but the where it stops place. It makes me think of the ways that our faith traditions explain to us that we meet God. For example, in our behavior or in scripture only. Mm-hmm. Or in the right belief system. And if we just say the right words, we get into the club.
Sure. So you gotta know the secret handshake.
Right? So doesn't mysticism
brush up against that in a thorny way?
Well, it's interesting because there is speculation that all of the world's great religious traditions really began with some sort of a mystical encounter. Yeah, if you think about in, the Jewish Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, you have Moses encountering the burning bush.
Mm-hmm.
You have in the Christian New Testament, you have St. Paul encountering the Spirit of Christ while he was on the road to Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of thing seems to happen again and again, and you can find similar analogs in the other great wisdom traditions of the world. Certainly Muhammad had his encounter with the sacred mystery. You have the encounters with Krishna, or other deities in the Eastern traditions as well. So I think it was the French poet, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Charles Peguy, I think it is, who said that what begins in mysticism ends in politics. And it's it's a wonderful line, and it's and I love it that he put it that way, because it's not just true in a religious sense, but maybe even in an aesthetic sense. Certainly in politics, or in the way we organize our social lives as well, that that the mystical again is very much centered in the heart, and very much centered in that kind of pure encounter. But human beings being human beings, we want to we want to build a monument, we want to have rules and regulations, we want to have a club, and once we have the club, then then the question is, who gets to be in the club and who doesn't. And I a lot of people, I think, who embrace a deep and radical spiritual practice oftentimes feel like there isn't a place for them in the institutional religious communities. The mystics historically have tended to have one foot in and one foot out. And so that's something that I find very interesting. I think that institutional religion is sometimes a very potent force for good. If you think about how Christians were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, for example, or the abolitionist movement, or whatever, Quakers leading the charge to eradicate slavery. So you can see where sometimes even, what we think of as religious people, as opposed to maybe spiritual people, can still be real channels for divine light and divine transformation in the world.
Absolutely.
But we all also know, I don't need to tell you, we all also know how the institution can sometimes be very oppressive. It can sometimes really, really put limitations on us as well. So I think mysticism is that kind of spiritual nexus point where maybe the wisdom that you can find sometimes in the institution meets that more universal wisdom that can't be boxed. It can't be contained by any one culture or any one lineage. And so, one of the things that you often find is that people who are drawn to mystical forms of spirituality, even if they're devout Christians or devout Muslims or something like that, they tend to color outside the lines, and they tend to want to learn from all of the world's great traditions, which is why, I am a practicing Christian. I'm involved in the Christian religion, but I'm very comfortable with a community like Zeitgeist, because this is a place where I know I can encounter Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and, people, spiritually independent people who are interested in that deep mystical connection. Yeah. And so, back to the course, one of my hopes for the course is that over the time that we're together, we can look at some of these institutional expressions of spirituality to kind of appreciate these different expressions, if you will, different colors of the rainbow, but then also to never lose sight of the entire rainbow, and to recognize that there's also this dimension of spiritual wisdom that can't be contained by any one lineage or any one, dogma. Trying to find that sweet spot where you can appreciate these different wells, these different kind of sources, but then find how they actually can support one another for a more holistic spiritual practice. Again, wherever you find yourself, And I'm also somebody who radically believes in the beauty of diversity. I'm not a monoculturalist. I certainly don't think everybody needs to believe the same way or vote the same way or look the same way or talk the same way. And that, it's wonderful that, there are radical different traditions. Even if I became a Buddhist, I will never know Buddhism the way that somebody who grew up in Tibet will.
Right.
I don't speak the language. It hasn't been forming me since I was a little child. And so appreciating that there's that entire depth that I'll never fully know, but I can at least get a taste of it. And through the graciousness and the generosity of wisdom teachers from, say, for example, to use my example, from Tibet, who have come to America, who have written, and then their writings have been translated into English and so forth. So, so the glass half empty, glass half full, we can never fully appreciate all of the wisdom that is presented to us, but we can have the wisdom that our finite bodies can contain. And that is, generally speaking, it's enough. It's enough to lead us to joy, and it's enough to lead us to living lives of service and of deep transformation.
I think the beauty of leaning into the personal experience, that individual connection with the divine, I use the word individual loosely, is it removes the potential for hierarchy. It removes the potential for power over. It removes the potential for my interpretation of wisdom literature is correct and yours is not. Yeah. It creates an opening for that pure relationship. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's we could play with this for a long time, because I think that one of the reasons why so many people are drawn to make that deep dive into a more experiential, more embodied type of spirituality is because it's been denied to us.
Right.
That too many of the institutions, you picked on Catholicism, but I grew up a Protestant, and I can tell you the Protestants can be just as bad.
Oh, I will agree.
that so many of the institutions, they get caught up in preserving the institution, or in preserving the status quo. And this is why you see, so many churches put such an emphasis on sexual morality, for example. And what they're trying to do is trying to kind of revive a sexual morality that they think was the good old days. And what they forget is that in the good old days, it was just as bad. So, but I think it was one of my mentors, a man named Kenneth Leach, who said that the shadow side of Christianity is always trying to restore the morality of the grandparents' generation. And so that was just as true 50 or 60 years ago, when there were people thinking, we need to go back to the way it was in the 1930s. The 1960s had gotten so bad,
right.
and now people saying, well, we need to go back to the 1950s, and so it's just, rather than asking this question of, how is the Spirit at work in our lives and in people's lives today, and looking for that way of responding to the present moment. So the institution always has the risk of nostalgia, the risk of thinking it used to be better back then. And I think, as I think I tend to be a little allergic to the word experience, because I think it has its own trap. But I like the word embodiment, and this idea of an embodied spirituality, a spirituality that rests in my heart, in my gut, in my bones. That's, first of all, it's real. It's not abstract, and it takes us right to where we need to be. In terms of, when you think of the wisdom teachings, love your neighbors, love your enemies, be forgiving, be kind, be merciful, be compassionate. All of those are embodied mandates, embodied invitations that, and again, if you want to get into what mysticism is, I would argue that one of the universal kind of traits of a mystical spirituality is that it is a spirituality of embodying the divine, embodying the sacred. Yes. That we become manifestations of the sacred in human form. I think it was John O'Donohue, the Irish mystic, who said, that we are the spirit breathed into clay. You know, it's just that's it in a nutshell. You know, clay given life, clay given spirit, and so this beautiful marriage of earth and heaven. That's the dignity of what it means to be a human being. And most of us, we get lost in, I mean, very real issues in trauma and anxiety and in fear, in avarice or greed, you know, these kinds of things that oftentimes close us off from the miracle of simply being here and simply being available to be in relationship and to be agents of compassion and of change and of reconciliation. So, so mysticism on the one hand, it's very, you were kind of teasing me, it's this kind of, sparklies out in the cloud kind of, union with God and all that kind of stuff. But on another hand, it's also very, very down to earth. So it's, it's not so much about getting us into heaven as it is about getting heaven into us.
Oh,
and so,
love it.
So, so why talk about Christian mysticism and then Jewish mysticism and then, Sufism, why talk about these different schools? Well, back to your three-legged stool analogy, the embodied experience is unique to each one of us. But then what those different traditions represent are different stories, different lineages, different cultures, different languages. Different ways of interpreting the embodied experience, and then different ways of reflecting on how we actually express that. So, for example, in Kabbalah, you have the amazing kind of teaching about the tree of life, which is really, it's like a blueprint to the mind of God. So it becomes this really, beautiful tool that we can use, that anyone can use, to kind of look under the hood of the engine that runs the divine, the majesty of the divine, the heart of God. Why would we want to do that? Well, the question is, once again, how do you get that divine love, that divine magic, if you will, into our hearts? How do we bring the heart of God into our hearts? And what does that look like once we do? And the Kabbalah is an entire system that gives us insight into that. So, so the different mystical traditions, it's like each one is a different path up the mountain. It's the same mountain, looking at the same summit, but the view is going to be different from each one of the paths. And rather than getting into kind of an argument of, well, this path is better than that path, it's like, well, why not celebrate them all? And why not celebrate the fact that you do have a different view, you do have a different experience on each one of the paths. And again, I'll never fully know what it means to be a Buddhist, but I can learn a little bit about it. And maybe my friends who are Buddhists can kind of give me a little bit of insight. And that leads to another thing that I'm hoping we're going to do in this program, is that we will have a practice every night. So it won't just be, me just, blathering away for 90 minutes. There will be a talk, there will be, some discussion of material that will ask people to reflect on, but then we'll lead into a meditation experience that will be shaped by each one of the different traditions. So, you can say, well, meditation is meditation, but there are different schools of meditation, different practices, different techniques, different methods, if you will. And so we'll be looking at some of those different methods. In a 7-week course, nobody's going to become a master of any one tradition, but so it's a bit, there's a little bit of spiritual speed dating going on. But yeah, hey, but the idea is that in that, even in a 7-week period, you begin to get a sense of what Ken Wilber calls the orienting generalization, the sense of the lay of the land. And then what I'm hoping is that each person will walk away saying, maybe Christian mysticism didn't really do it for me, but the Kabbalah, I can't get enough of that, or Sufism, can't get enough of that, or whatever.
That's my flavor,
And then, again, not with, well, this is right, this is wrong, but rather, this is where I'm called. This is how I can take my adventure of responding to the love of the divine, the love of God, deeper.
Now, is this, I don't want anybody to feel like we're going to be jumping in a deep end in a scary way. So what if I'm a beginner? What if I've never done this before? Is this going to be hard? Is it,
well, the first thing I will say is that we're all beginners. I mean, people who have, I've been meditating since the early 1980s, and I still feel very, very much like a beginner. Maybe it's because I'm a slacker at meditation. I don't know, but that's certainly, and yet I've heard other people say similar things. So the first thing I would say is that the beautiful thing about spiritual practices is that they're infinitely scalable, and they're very accessible for somebody who's brand new, but they continue to be kind of challenging and invigorating even for the person who's been at it for 30 or 40 years. So there will be no assumption of prior experience or prior knowledge on my part. So people of all levels of spiritual practice are welcome. But even, for somebody who's been at it for a while, I would still say, I hope you'll consider participating in this, because I believe that there's always, a new perspective. To go back to the mountain analogy, you take a little turn around that path and suddenly it's an entirely new vista. And so, so hopefully, we'll have the opportunity to offer some new insights for the old timers, as well as that, invitation for folks who may be brand new to this.
I'm so happy to hear that. Another question, thinking about practice, when we were originally imagining what this might look like, we were imagining us in the same room and, having that sense of presence together. And, we're being invited to do this remotely. The universe is helping us figure out how to figure that out. So how will how will that be? What can I expect?
Well, we are in what now? March, April, May, June, July, month 5 of life with COVID, and it's obviously this is very scary, and I think we're all very concerned. We want to stay healthy. We want our loved ones to remain healthy. Just, for people who may not be familiar with me, a lot of the work that I do is traveling and going to different places and leading retreats and teaching classes on various aspects of the spiritual life. And so, as you can imagine, the month of March in 2020 was a difficult month for me, because it was, I now call it the month of cancellations, because I basically, all of my work for the rest of the year just got canceled, just one after another. And I just saw all these trips that I had planned, just one by one, getting canceled. And, and obviously there was some anxiety there, because that was my livelihood as well. And then one community in St. Louis that I regularly work with, this was going to be my 4th time with them. They called me up and they said, we're going to have to cancel the retreat, but we don't want to leave you in the lurch. This moment of grace, they said, we still want to pay you. So can you do something for us online? And these were mostly, it was a group of Episcopalian women, some men too, but mostly Episcopalian, mostly older adults, so people in their 70s and 80s. And they weren't even sure what they were asking for. They just had kind of this intuitive sense that we can do our retreat online. And it was a wonderful moment of invitation for me. And so, I was familiar with Zoom because I've been working on a podcast for the last several years, and we do like what you and I are doing right now, record interviews on Zoom and so forth. But it never had really occurred to me that you could actually create kind of a practice space, a spiritual practice space, even through, video conferencing. But we just stepped into it. And and from the first week, I just was amazed at, even though, we were separated by many, many miles, at how present people were, at how effortlessly the ability to have conversation, to have Q&A, even to move into silence, to move into the meditation experience, that, that the technology really does lend itself well. The only thing it doesn't really do is if everybody is like singing, you're trying to sing the same song, or trying to recite the same prayer or something like that. For Zoom is just not ready for that. Maybe 2 releases from now. So, but that's okay. That's, I think that's not something, certainly, chanting is a very beautiful and valid and important spiritual practice. That won't be part of this program because of the limitations, but that's really the only major limitation. And even if you talk about like on an energetic level, and people have that sense, if to really learn meditation, you need to be in a room with other meditators. And I've had that experience, so I understand the power of that. I don't know that, Zoom is maybe 100%, but I think it's still maybe 80 to 90%. I think you can still, the spirit is not limited by miles. So you can still have that kind of energetic experience, even working through technology. So, so that would be the thing that I would say. It's just, I've been very, very pleasantly surprised. And, to put a happy ending to my story, here it is now, the 1st of July, when you and I are recording this. My calendar is just as full as it was at the beginning of March. The only thing that's missing now is the travel. And, the Atlanta airport gets old after a while. So, so I think I can live without the travel. But it's just that I think so many people have found that the online experience is still spiritually meaningful, and people can still have really, really meaningful encounters, not only with one another, with me and the participants in the course, but most importantly of all, with spirit. So, so if somebody's new to it, I would say, give it a try, and of course, the beautiful thing is if I were teaching in Atlanta, that would really limit the participation just to people who, probably within a 30-mile radius. But now, obviously we can hopefully, connect with some people even outside the metro Atlanta area who might want to do this program.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we do as well. We did Jerome Loba's workshop. We had to pivot quickly, and we were, just to reinforce what you're saying, we were surprised at how well it worked out. So we're not hesitant. We are looking forward to it. I was just, I love how you have been reassuring to folks who are considering that. So that's wonderful. Thinking about the pandemic, I want to rewind a little bit and invite you to connect some dots for us, because I think it was really powerful what you were saying about embodiment. Okay. And that could be a whole other conversation. What is forcing all of us to reevaluate, as the cliche goes, the new normal, and what will come out of this tension that has been created for us? The illness that is changing and reshaping culture, economies, politics, everything else, it's embodied. Mm-hmm. It's embodied. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We are protecting our bodies. We are protecting the bodies of our loved ones. Mm-hmm. If we layer the Black Lives Matter movement and the attention that hopefully all of us are placing on the importance of Black lives, that is embodied. Mm-hmm. Well, that is an identity that is in your skin. And let me layer on one other piece of that too. We just, as you mentioned, we're recording this early in July, and June is Pride Month. Mm-hmm. And, queer identity is embodied. So as we recognize how we live our lives in our physical bodies and how we live our spiritual lives in our bodies, is mysticism, how do we locate that in our current reality?
The first thing I'd like to do is quote a mutual friend of ours, Loretta Coleman Brown, mm-hmm. Who, of course, is she was a professor of psychology at Agnes Scott and is now a retreat leader like I am, and much of her focus is on the work of Howard Thurman. He's a son of Atlanta. So Howard Thurman, obviously with his connection to Atlanta, Loretta speaks about multiple pandemics. And she usually is speaking of two pandemics, the pandemic of coronavirus and the pandemic of racism. But you brought up at least a third or a fourth, the pandemic of homophobia and the pandemic of transphobia. And, then you can also add the pandemic of sexism or the pandemic of, really any kind of exclusionary system of, systematic oppression or systematic
Right.
exclusion. We see that in how we organize our economy. Capitalistic economies tend to be very exclusionary. They're built on a kind of a myth of scarcity, that kind of thing. So, and you're right, all of this is profoundly embodied. It impacts us in our bodies. And we, the shadow side of a lot of religious and spiritual work is that it can become very abstracted. It's very much about language. It's very much about, symbolism, that kind of thing. And, I think language is important because language is a way we connect with one another, and it's a way we share meaning. So I'm not saying that we need to get rid of language and symbols, but I think that we always have to be looking as, how do I bring this back into my body, into my heart, into my lungs, into my genitals, into my belly, and learning to, so learning to sit with the reality in which we find ourselves. And the reality of pandemic, whether it's a virus that, the weirdest virus in the world, because many people are just asymptomatic. They're carriers, and maybe not even necessarily getting a lot of people sick, but then there are those, what they call the super carriers, and they get 20 or 30 people sick. And then, of course, the small percentage who get very, very sick, and then the even smaller percentage whose lives are at risk. But because so many people are sick, those small percentages have still translated into tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide who have lost their lives or who have had debilitating illness. So, this is nothing to laugh about. It's a profound, scary problem. And what we're going through, this process of social distancing and self-isolation and, wearing masks and, rethinking, how do we interact with people? How do we, what is the role of like, again, religious work where people often sing. Well, singing is a way that the virus can be transmitted.
Yeah.
So this is why you hear about choirs or churches where suddenly everybody, or weddings where everybody gets infected, funerals, because of, that it's like they're the perfect storm. So we're rethinking all of that. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, those kinds of things. I mean, not everybody gets that those things are evil. Some people are blinded by privilege. But fortunately, I hope, I believe that more and more people, even those who have social privilege, more and more people are beginning to recognize that this is a serious systemic illness that we have to cleanse, purge, again, from our bodies. And I'm speaking both on the individual level, but also on the corporate level, the body of society as well. So the question then, why are we doing a class on mysticism when we've got all these serious social, and physiological problems? And I guess the argument that I would make is, sometimes when the computer isn't working, you need a software upgrade. To get things back on track. And so I think what mystical spirituality really does represent is that kind of software upgrade, that kind of, adopting wisdom, again, wisdom which in some cases is centuries or even millennia old, but that's still very, very relevant and very much speaks to the reality of the present day. I mentioned Howard Thurman, a great American mystic, has so much, this African American, was raised Baptist, in segregated Jim Crow Florida, has so much to say to us about how bringing spiritual wisdom and spiritual compassion to the horrific problem, the horrific evil of racism, can empower us to make a real difference. On that physiological side, you've got Julian of Norwich, the great medieval English mystic who lived during the bubonic plague, which of course was a pandemic that literally killed, I think most scholars think, anywhere from 30 to 50% of the population. died within an 18-month period. So it's funny with the people who are, whining about the economy now, I'm like, boy, you don't know how bad it can get, because that would just absolutely devastate not only people's lives. I mean, with that much death, everybody is touched. Everybody is left grieving, the ones who survive. But then also the entire economic structure is disrupted as well. And so here is this mystic, Julian of Norwich, living during this time and having visions of God and then writing about that and really bringing some very practical wisdom to bear about, how to live in these really very dangerous, very uncertain times. So, what I would say is that, mysticism may not give us a direct roadmap, but it's like mysticism is a way to learn how to read the map. It's a way to learn how to see the landmarks, how to find your orientation, find your direction, and be able to get more of a sense of where we are, where we want to be, and what the path looks like to get from here to there. And there's a strong, tradition that to be a true mystic, sooner or later, it means being of service to others. Think about the Bodhisattva Vow in Buddhism. This idea that, that I will even delay my enlightenment in the interest of helping all sentient beings become enlightened. Again, that's very flowery spiritual language, but it has a real world application, that you used the word kenosis a few minutes ago. That's this kind of self-giving, self-emptying, self-surrendering kind of position of profound compassion that says, this thing we're doing, this spiritual project we're in the middle of, isn't just about my comfort, my, having a cool experience with God, but it's actually about radical solidarity, primarily with those who suffer.
Right,
so the spirit, back to the the groups we've been talking about, people of color, queer people, women, people who lack economic resources. That's where the spirit has always gravitated towards the people who have been excluded in society.
100% of the time. Yeah.
And even excluded by institutional religions. Yeah. So, so again, that's back to that mysticism has one foot in the institution and one foot out, because the mystics have always been the one who've been the most radically present to suffering wherever it occurs, but not just to make a fetish out of suffering, but to be, actively engaged in how do we bring transformation to this? How do we bring healing and bring new life?
Yeah. Agreeing with everything 100%. And I would add one other small piece of it too, and that would be when we start from a mystic foundation, not knowing is okay. Not knowing is that entry. And when the world turns upside down, as we're having the sensation of being comfortable with not knowing, really puts you steps ahead of people who feel very tied to knowing, controlling, and thinking that because they were raised with a particular belief system, a particular way of living, a particular way of doing things, that, hey, I've got this tied up. And it's like, yeah, but you don't.
Jesus, to use just one example, Jesus's most kind of trenchant criticism was aimed at the Pharisees. The Pharisees were they were the institutional religious leaders of his culture, and so it wasn't like, Jesus was trying to criticize the Jews. I mean, that's how it's been misinterpreted, but he was actually going after kind of the nice, moral, upstanding, the kind of people that would win awards from the city, get the key to the city, that kind of thing, that they would be, their high school, of course they didn't have high schools, but their high school would pick them as the outstanding alumnus, or whatever, the respectable folks. You know, and Jesus, again, this kind of outsider mystic, he comes after them and says, look, what you guys are doing is actually causing as much harm as good, if not more. And, you know, and it's fascinating then that what did Jesus' followers do? They just created a new institution, you know, and then so why have there been reformations like the Protestant Reformation to try to, you know, break free out of that, and then creating more institutions. So it's almost like this interesting dance that we go into, you know, that human nature, we seem to like to codify things, but then as soon as we codify things, there needs to be another movement to kind of bust the doors open and bring a new spirit of freedom and possibility.
But mysticism, if I am understanding it correctly, the only code is God. There's no pillars other than.
Well, you know, there's teachings, you know, but even the teachings disagree.
What do the teachings point to, right?
Yeah. You know, the good ones point beyond themselves.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And
that's what I'm saying is the teaching is, you know, be cautious of teaching.
You know.
Unless
you got it all wrong. Don't worship me. You got it all wrong. You know. So, you know, you even see this with Jesus. You know, Jesus told one person, he says, "Look, nobody is good. Only God is good." You know, and it was because the person had called him good. You know, and it's like, you know, what is Jesus doing here? Well, he is, you know, he's trying to get away from that tendency we have to put people on pedestals, because once we put them on a pedestal, we stop taking them seriously. You know, and Dorothy Day, the amazing woman who worked with the poorest of the poor in Manhattan for many years, and who is now being considered to become a saint in the Catholic Church. She was a devout Catholic, but somebody asked her when she was still alive, you know, will you be a saint someday? And she said, oh heavens, I hope not. They said, what do you mean? And she said, I don't want to be dismissed so easily. What a, you know,
wow.
What true wisdom there, you know. It's like, don't make a little statue of me that people can put on their dashboards, and then they ignore what I actually am saying, you know. So back to our topic, mysticism is get rid of the statues, get rid of the little holy cards, the laminated cards, and get back to the teachings, because the teachings, again, point beyond themselves and point to that divine spirit. That again, where do you find it? You find it in your heart. You know, and you find it in the sky and in the stars and in loved ones' eyes. And, you know, Ignatius of Loyola said, find God in all things, you know. This idea, you know, the Buddha, you know, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Well, why would you want to kill the Buddha? Because again, you need to find that Buddha within yourself. Don't put all that energy into being devoted to some external Buddha. Find the Buddha within. So, you know,
well, before we wrap it up, I want to say that I did speak to Jesus earlier this afternoon, and he did say that you were good, Carl.
Okay. All right. Well, since I've been endorsed by Jesus, I can't.
He said if you have to sit down with a teacher, Carl McColman is the one to do it with. Okay. And he said that we all need to sign up for your workshop in the fall.
Right. So don't disappoint Jesus. Take this class.
Well, Carl, I will remind people how to sign up and how to find you. And there's more where this came from. We're just scratching the surface.
Sure, of course. Yeah, and I know that on your website there's more of a description of the actual program.
Yes.
And so hopefully people can go and check that out. If they have any questions or whatever, you know, let you know or let me know, and you know, we'll take it from there. And we start September 28th, I believe.
Monday night, September 28th. 7 weeks, ending on November 9th.
All right, wonderful.
Starting at 7 p.m.
Eastern time.